Hey, you sister students, it's Mr. Baker again. This is another installment of Baker's Corner. We're going to look today at a little bit more involvement by the United States when it comes to the idea of Cold War policy. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you go back to our last lesson, we talked about American containment, right? And we said that for the most part, guys, containment is going to involve trying to bottle up or actually stop the further spread of communism. It already exists, right? At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union is going to, obviously be heavily influencing Eastern Europe. It's going to be a pretty expansive country. It's going to be, guys, heavily influencing parts of communist China in some ways. It becomes communist later on, and also eventually North Korea, amongst other places. All right. So the question is, guys, with all this American commitment to support, how do we start to see not just a commitment to it, but also the idea of action? There's a difference, I would argue, guys, between those two things. So I want you guys to think about last time. What is the big city in Germany that we said is going to become really a hot spot? And you guessed it, it's going to be Berlin. All right. Now, guys, take a look at the deal here. So you've got Berlin and all the eastern zone, which eventually is going to be the Eastern Germany. That's the Soviet zone. But guys, look at Berlin. It is divided, like we said last time. You've got East Berlin. You've got West Berlin that includes the other three zones, okay? And so, guys, what happens when you have a leader like Stalin that eventually kind of steps in and says, okay, you know what? We're going to actually stop a lot of the movement outside of Berlin. He does what is called a Berlin blockade, which is exactly the way that it sounds. Now, this is very early post-World War II, by about a year or two, okay? And I want you to put yourself in Harry S. Truman's position. Now, this is one thing that Truman, guys, has on his side, and that is the Soviet Union do not develop their version of the atomic bomb until the later 40s. So they don't have this device yet, all right? So you could say, well, man, does that give the United States an advantage? Perhaps it does, all right? But I think it's safe to say, guys, it's probably not a good idea to go back into another major war, given that the Second World War is so closely finished by only a couple of years. So what would you do if you're Truman? What can you do? I mean, if you send military specifically on the ground into East Berlin, essentially you're precipitating a war in a way. And so he gets creative. So guys, this Berlin airlift, right? You notice like a lot of these planes that are moving back and forth Berlin, all right, they're moving in there, guys, in huge numbers. I mean, you can do the math, but I mean, I think I read somewhere, guys, at the height of this, there was a plane that was landing in West Berlin to resupply the people there. I think it was like every half a minute to a minute. This was an expansive operation. All right. Why would he do it? Well, think about the message it sends if you don't. You're backing down from Soviet influence, and you don't want to do that given that containment is pretty much a policy that we're moving toward. Okay. So does he make the right decision? Does it work? Well, I would argue, guys, he does. And it does work. What does Stalin end up doing? He calls off the blockade, not right away, right? This blockade lasts well into the following year, okay? But I think it's safe to say, guys, that Truman puts his foot down and he acts in a way that he felt was appropriate. Now, down the line, this is actually into the 1960s, guys. You're going to see eventually this Berlin Wall become that symbol of that Cold War tension, right? Kind of like that Iron Curtain, as we said last time. All right. Now, Checkpoint Charlie, as it was also called, guys, this checkpoint here, you'll notice, again, a lot of the graffiti on the wall. This wall was not officially built. I think it was until the early 1960s. Okay. In fact, it's kind of a funny story with John F. Kennedy when he went to visit there, speaking to the West Berliners. He said in German, I'm not a good German student, guys, so pardon me if I'm off on this, Ike ein Berliner or something along those lines, which is kind of funny because if you think about it, he's trying to rouse the spirits of the people and he's trying to say, I'm a Berliner. And I think in some translations, it evidently came across as I'm a jelly donut or something like that. All right. But to give him a little bit of credit, I think the German people there that day and probably around the world were like, okay, we kind of understand what he's getting at. So it was a little bit of a fun little thing, but he was being very specific. Eventually, guys, in the later 80s down the line, you notice a similar speech by Ronald Reagan Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall speech that a lot of you guys may have heard of. So guys, this becomes an enduring symbol of a lot of people's view on oppression, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore it's built as a wall. Why would they do that? Well, it makes a lot of sense. If you have a lot of people that are trying to escape from the east to the west, this is one way to do it. And so the Soviets were trying to limit that movement. Okay. I had a person I met a few years ago that was in the military during this time period, told me a cool story. And evidently, guys, the side that was the Democratic side had a lot more beauty to it. Makes a lot of sense why, And one of the things that they would do to try to show acts of peace to the communist side is, I guess there was an apple tree. I don't know if it was a lot of them, but anyway. And evidently, guys, what they would do is they would throw the apples over. It's kind of like a sign of peace, and hey, we're praying for you, or we're thinking of you, or whatever. All right, so it's kind of a cool little thing to keep in mind. Okay, but it is going to be something, guys. If you've ever seen a picture of the wall, or at least a little bit of a piece of it, it's important. Okay, now what about as far as the Middle East? Okay, well, you got to go back to the Eisenhower Doctrine. All right. So this Eisenhower Doctrine, guys, if you think about it, is going to be made by President Eisenhower. He's the president that succeeds Harry Truman. All right. So post-World War II, shortly after World War II, Truman is still in office when this happened. Keep this in mind. We have the establishment of the nation of Israel. Now, as you can imagine, this is not going to be the most popular thing by a lot of the Arab countries that surround Israel. Here's Israel. And a lot of the Arab world, guys, that you see, that's very close. There are ideological differences politically, there are cultural differences religiously and also ethnically, etc. Okay. And so, guys, what we notice is that within, hours, probably even minutes, to be honest, of David Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister of Israel, he makes an announcement. Hey, we are now a country. A lot of the Arab world, guys, gets ready for a war. And they did not defeat Israel. All right. So America is going to take a very strong position of supporting Israel. A lot of it, guys, went back to, heritage of wanting to encourage democracy. Now, think about it like this. It's the Cold War. What's the problem with this? Well, it's almost you're choosing two sides. You're either Democratic or you're basically not, right? Or communist, some people would say. So if you think about it, guys, this is going to be a standoff, because if we're supporting Israel, who's going to see this as an avenue to actually get involved with the Arab world? It's going to be the Soviet Union, right? So the Soviet Union, guys, is going to start to become more involved. We'll look at the Aswan Dam issue here in a second. All right. And so if you're Eisenhower, guys, and you've inherited this policy from Truman, all right, you're going to continue to follow it. And so the Eisenhower Doctrine is basically Eisenhower's version of the Truman Doctrine. It's going to extend support ideologically to basically any country in the Middle East, basically, that wanted our support in their fight against communism. All right. So you're looking at, countries like, eventually it's not on the map here, but it would be right over here, Iran, etc. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, this is going to strain American relations with, of course, this part of the world, right? Okay. And so what happens, guys, in the later 1950s, all right, you have a major thing going on in Egypt. We call this the Suez Canal incident. All right. So, guys, if you look here, you'll notice the Suez Canal was built by different sets of interests. A lot of them were European. All right. And, guys, if you take a look here, I want you to notice the geography of the Suez Canal. All right. So it's a man-made waterway, a lot like the Panama Canal, right? Okay. It's a little bit longer than the Panama Canal is, as you can see here. All right. And guys, if you think about it, what does it allow countries to do? Not just Egypt. It allows them to have a greater flow of resources between the Mediterranean Sea and also eventually this area to the south. Okay. Now, why is it a big deal? Well, guys, when most people think of the Middle East from a resource perspective, they usually think of oil first. So what's going to happen? So Egypt wants to build this Aswan Dam. And so they go to countries like the U.S., Great Britain, etc., and they say, okay, help us out. And for whatever reason, the United States and other countries that were more democratic were like, no, we're not going to do that. That opens up an avenue for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gives very partial aid. It does not support the entire project. All right. But guys, why is it a problem? Well, the leader of Egypt eventually is going to threaten to nationalize the Suez Canal. Do any of you know what that means? Well, it's kind of a term that you don't come across every day, guys, but we'll try to simplify it. Essentially, what that means is he's putting it under direct Egyptian control. So in other words, guys, the world community is going to have less access to this Suez Canal. And they're thinking oil prices. They're thinking energy. And so what happens? Well, this is interesting. This is where Eisenhower, guys, gets more involved. Three countries get together and actually invade or do a military expedition, guys, against Egypt. It's going to be Israel. It's going to be Great Britain and also France. What country did I not mention? The United States. If you're Eisenhower, guys, how do you feel about that? You're now the leader of the free world. And you guessed it. He's not going to be happy. He's going to be like, really? You didn't consult us. So he condemns the air raids and things like that. All right. And guys, what eventually happens, the UN puts pressure because of partly due to Eisenhower's interests. And guys, eventually those three countries eventually withdraw. Okay. Now, a lot of you guys are wondering, okay, is it really that big of a deal? Well, guys, check this out. Okay. So you're looking at, I think it's 13,800 miles. If you go all the way around the southern tip of Africa from London all the way over to Mumbai, which is India, guys, keep in mind. All right. Without the Suez Canal, when you have a Suez Canal that will allow travel between the same two locations, as you can see here, it's going to be almost half of that trip. So this is going to be important. Now, guys, I can tell you this is really big because eventually moving forward, I once heard one Defense Department and also Secretary of State Department or State Department officials say this, guys, it became an official American wartime policy, right? Or at least defense policy, that if there was any stoppage of the flow of oil in that region of the world, particularly, right? So we're talking about the Gulf, all right, this area of the Gulf, okay, that it would be the United States' responsibility, guys, to actually do something about it, all right? And a lot of you guys are like, okay, well, Mr. Baker, down the line, did we do that? Yeah, we did. Now, what a lot of these countries did, guys, 15 to be exact, down the line, is they're still going to say, well, we still want to have a greater influence on oil. So what do? They formed, if you've ever heard of it, called OPEC, which stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. That's going to be around 1960. Most of those countries are going to be in Northern Africa and the Middle East. There are a few of them outside of there. The only one in the Western Hemisphere, by the way, is going to be Venezuela. Okay. So one of our countries in the same hemisphere as we are, of course. Okay. And so, guys, what we notice is that I think Eisenhower's actions here, when he steps in and basically puts his foot down, says something, guys, again, about the changing status of American policy, American, identity during this conflict. Okay. Now, what about the situation in China? Well, guys, do any of you recognize the figure? This is actually an Andy Warhol painting from the 50s and 60s. Okay. It is Mao Zedong. All right. So during World War II, guys, you have this big division that's happening in China between the leaders like Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-shek. By the way, there's a few different spellings of their names based on phonetics and everything. Based on some different, spellings, excuse me. All right. But guys, what happens is, well, Japan invaded. And it's like, okay, what do we do? Do we let Japan defeat us? Do we put our differences aside for the moment, fight them, and then kind of resettle them later on? Well, that's pretty much what happened. Well, post-World War II, they go back to a civil war. All right. So this civil war, as you can imagine, is going to be a war, again, like a lot of the Cold War wars will be, between different sets of interests. Chiang Kai-shek is going to be the more nationalist leader. I hesitate to say completely democratic. because he does have his shortcomings. But guys, he is not a communist like Mao Zedong. Okay, so what happens? Well, you guessed it. The United States is going to become involved. We're going to say, okay, you know what? We're going to support eventually the split that ends up supporting Taiwan. Okay, so guys, this is a big deal, however, because all this territory that you see on the left here, this is eventually going to become the People's Republic of China. This is going to be essentially Mao's leadership part of China. This part, which is very small, guys, you can see it along the coast of China, which is small. This is eventually going to be Taiwan. Now, a lot of you guys are wondering, okay, Mr. Baker, why is this such a big deal? Well, eventually, remember, guys, or actually not eventually, but this time, China has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. And the United States develops what we call a one China policy. What does that mean? It means that we formally acknowledge the rightful authority of one of those two sides. And why is that a big deal? Because if you have a one China policy, that means that you only have one China in the UN Security Council. And that one China for years and years is actually going to be Taiwan. Right? Now, I know a lot of you have actually watched the movie Forrest Gump down the line, and you saw him going over and playing ping pong, and a lot of us guys laugh and we giggle about that. Guys, eventually down the line, the idea of opening up China to things like trade, etc., there was truly a ping pong diplomacy. That is not a joke. Now, the way that the movie presented it has a little bit of humor to it. All right, because I think it was eventually not just Nixon that made a venture there in the early 70s, but even President Carter later down the line, that's in the later 70s, keep in mind, is actually going to formally acknowledge the People's Republic. And that's a big deal because, guys, if you formally acknowledge them and you keep a one China policy, then what does that mean? It means that they're going to eventually replace Taiwan with the UN Security Council, which is a pretty big deal. Okay. All right. So what else is going on, guys? By the early 50s, China is divided into communist China and also nationalist China, like we just said. And this brings up one of the bigger conflicts. This is definitely what people guys label as a proxy war. Okay. This is the Korean War. It's also called the Forgotten War. Okay. So if you think about it, guys, what really stands out about Korea? Well, first of all, it's not big. But putting it in one person's, guys, description, it is basically important for a lot of reasons. And the reason being is because it was very strategic. It is right to the south of China and right to the west of Japan, which would be right over there. Okay? And so therefore, guys, at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union entered the war a little bit later in the Pacific. And what happens? Well, you eventually have a dividing line at the 38th parallel. And the 38th parallel is going to have Soviet influence in the north and also more democratic and American influence in the south. Okay? So eventually, guys, what happens is that you have in June of 1950, just keeping that in context, North Korea invaded the south. Why is that a big deal? Well, first of all, they were trying to reunite the peninsula under one government, and they couldn't do it. All right. The leader of South Korea was not a saint either, kind of like Chiang Kai-shek, but he was not a communist. But there's a problem. Guys, the problem was, potentially, we gave very minimal weapons to South Korea. Defensive weapons. They weren't offensive. They were very limited. Guys, China and also especially the Soviet Union, they are supplying North Korea with weapons much stronger than that of the other countries that supplied the South. So, guys, when they literally invaded the South, this is the 38th parallel, guys, right here. Okay, before the war. After the war, it's going to change form just a little bit, but we still call it the 38th parallel. Okay, and so, guys, what they did is they invaded. All right, with the goal of reuniting the peninsula under one government. Well, that's obviously a no-no. The UN votes. Soviet Union was not there to vote. I'm 99.9% certain they would have vetoed that vote had they been. They did not. What happens, ladies and gentlemen, is eventually North Korea gets to about this area of what we call the Pusan perimeter. which is, as you can see, a very small part. The UN formally makes a declaration of getting involved. Okay. And eventually the United States is going to take a really big hand in this war. And this is eventually what we call a police action. Right? It is not a formally declared war by Congress, the way that World War II was, World War I, okay, Spanish-American War, list goes on and on. All right. And some people think that this was a mistake. All right. But nonetheless, the United States commits to the security of South Korea. Now, they put Douglas MacArthur in charge. That's his picture right there. Okay. Now, the ultimate goal, guys, if you talk to Truman, Truman's like, okay, our ultimate goal is to push North Korea back across the 38th parallel, right? And that makes a lot of sense. MacArthur had different sets of ambitions. So MacArthur, guys, gets there and they start pushing the North Koreans back. Here's the problem. He doesn't stop at the 38th parallel. So he keeps moving northward. Now, guys, take a look at what's going on. So this is the border between North Korea and China. China threatens to get more involved if the UN keeps moving northward. Why? The argument is that their security is at risk. This is definitely, guys, a containment-based war. It's also a proxy war. We did not fight the Soviet Union directly, but we did fight the interests of democracy versus communism, ergo a proxy war. Okay? So the importance with Korea, guys, is at the end of the war, there is a armistice that, by the way, is still in effect today. And that's why we're going to have what we call this truce line that is technically still at the 38th parallel. Korea, true or false, is still divided today. And the answer is yes. Now, I once heard somebody say, guys, with Korea, it's essentially a victory, a loss, and a tie all in the same breath. Why would somebody say that? Well, it's a victory because South Korea did not fall to communism. It's a tie because North Korea is still, obviously not democratic. And I guess you can make that same argument with the loss. Okay? But the good thing is, guys, in a sense, is that we didn't have a nuclear war. There were some people, by the way, by this period of time, the Soviet Union does have the atomic bomb. Both sides are making progress toward a hydrogen bomb, right? Which, by the way, is done by the early 50s. Okay. But guys, one thing that's interesting about this war is that this shows a clear ideological clash between the goals of Truman and also the goals of MacArthur. MacArthur, guys, when he is basically going further into North Korea, I forgot to mention this really quick, he is technically disobeying orders. Truman pulls the plug on him. MacArthur, guys, you got to remember, was a significant war hero. I mean, you're talking about a person that was a 5-star general. All right. He had been in the military over 5 decades of his life. Probably could have ran for president in 1952 had Eisenhower not been the person that won the nomination. So when he came back, even though he defied orders, guys, and Truman, by the way, is keeping office until 1953, the war is still going on when he's leaving. Eisenhower ends up ending it. Okay. But anyway, guys, but MacArthur is still a significant hero, which I think is pretty important. Okay. So if you're taking a look, guys, further, you can pause the screen if you want. This kind of shows you a little bit of a better transition of the war. Okay. And then eventually, like we said, guys, a moment ago, you are going to eventually have China entering the war, and they eventually do have some progress with pushing further south. Okay. That's the reason why Seoul is the capital of South Korea, and Pyongyang is, of course, the capital of North Korea, right? So it's still divided. Okay. What about American relations, guys, with the Western Hemisphere? This is where you have to focus on Cuba. Okay. So the Cuban Revolution, or the Castro Revolution, guys, is going to take place in 1959. This is Castro. This is Nikita Khrushchev. He's actually the leader of the Soviet Union. Okay. Why is this a problem? Cuba is only 90 miles, as you can see, from Florida. So they're overthrown. Eisenhower is really concerned about this for good reason. And he says, okay, what we can do. So the CIA, which stands for Central Intelligence Organization or Agency, guys, pardon me, is going to get in the plans of creating what's called eventually the Bay of Pigs plan. Okay, which basically is a plan to train Cubans, guys, that had exiled themselves to southern Florida, basically Miami. All right. And so what happens? Well, he chooses not to go forward with it. Guess who the next president is? It's going to be John F. Kennedy. Okay. So basically, guys, Castro's in office. We want to try to overthrow him. Kennedy is the next president. Kennedy gives the green light to go forward with the Bay of Pigs. So if you're kind of wondering, guys, what is the basic nuts and bolts of the Bay of Pigs? They pick strategic areas of Cuba that they were actually going to attack. This one being the Bay of Pigs, as you can see. Does not work. The people were basically overthrown. Okay, a lot of them were taken captive. There was a lot of negative attention, guys, brought to Kennedy with him not using airstrikes to support the exilers, if you will. Okay, and guys, as a result of that, that's going to be in 1961. Now, keep in mind, guys, this is a Soviet satellite nation 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This is not good if you're somebody like Kennedy and even the United States. The year after, and I'll end with this, guys, for the sake of time, we have what very well could have been the closest that we've ever came to a nuclear war. Okay. So, guys, a lot of you are like, well, okay, it says that we're at the brink. What does that mean? Guys, it basically meant, in a sense, we're about that close to an exchange of some sort that very easily could have led to not just a nuclear war, but possibly World War III. Now, a lot of you guys are wondering, okay, Mr. Baker, we don't want war, but why is it different in 1963 or two, than it would have been, let's say, back even at the end of World War II? Well, first of all, guys, remember, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union have nuclear bombs. They have atomic bombs, and they also have nuclear missiles. Okay, that's why the Sputnik launch was so big. So what happens? Well, the Soviet Union guys were like, okay, we're just going to start to build these missile sites. This is what the missile sites look like. Now, a lot of you guys are wondering, well, Mr. Baker, how did America find out about the missile sites? Well, I'm glad that you all asked. Basically, U-2 fly planes that were designed to be able to fly at very high altitudes and also take very, very good photographs. Guys, this is basically what one of the U-2 aircraft actually saw. So what do? They bring it to the attention of John F. Kennedy, and he immediately gets his cabinet together, his Joint Chiefs of Staff, which are basically his military advisors, his other advisors, of course, other people like that. And guys, the conclusion that they come to first and foremost is that these missiles cannot exist. They can't. Americans are at risk. And if you're kind of wondering, okay, how big of a deal was this? What could the Soviet Union have done? Guys, if you look at the map here, all right, Cuba is right here. They eventually found out the kinds of missiles that they were building. So, of course, America has intelligence. So we start to look into it. Guys, this is the radius that those missiles could have actually attacked. Now, what stands out to you about the radius? This is not just most of the United States. It's a good portion of Canada. It's all of Mexico. It's all of Central America. And it's also, as you can see, a sizable part of South America. In other words, guys, this is a threat to America and also our American allies. What can he do? Well, first of all, he can't allow the missiles to work. But he doesn't want a war. So what does he do? Well, there's a lot of division. I won't go into all the details, guys, but some of the military people really wanted airstrikes. Take out the missiles now. We can guarantee we'll get all the ones that exist. Kennedy wants to try a diplomatic approach that involves negotiation to an extent. And also he wants to be able to involve some degree of direct action. Now, when I say direct action, guys, I don't mean attacks. I mean the idea of using our Navy, right? So he sets up what he called a quarantine. He makes a famous speech to the American public I'll tell you a story about that in a second. And he basically told the American people, guys, he said, okay, we are quarantining, which is a fancy way of saying a blockade. Why doesn't he use the word blockade? Blockade would technically be considered an act of war. So he uses the term quarantine. Guys, this was a 13-day period. There's a wonderful film that's called 13 Days. There's another one that was a 5-part miniseries that came out in the 70s called The Missiles of October, I believe it was called. Guys, both of them are good. If you like something that's more modern, then you'll like 13 Days. It was created around 2000, 2001. But guys, at the end of the day, okay, we were within probably about 24 to 36 hours of airstrikes. And Kennedy says there's one more round of diplomacy. And so he says, all right, we're going to basically give in. At least that's the way some people saw it. But he says, all right, we can't go public with this. The Soviets can't go public. But guys, what America agreed to do in a private assurance was to do what was called taking away Jupiter missiles in Turkey. Now, a lot of you guys are like, well, Turkey, we've talked about that connection in the Cold War. Yeah. Okay. Those were considered to be obsolete, meaning that they weren't really, the top of the line. And guys, who was sent to actually do this negotiation? Not John F. Kennedy, not his Secretary of Defense, not his Secretary of State. It was actually his brother, the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy. And guys, if you watch the movie 13 Days closely, the Soviet ambassador says, if you could remove the missiles, we basically, would not have this problem, blah, blah, blah. All right. And what does Bobby Kennedy tell him? He says, we are not going to act under threat. That is not America's policy. Okay. And the guy is about ready to leave, and he picks up, at least he's on the verge of picking up, guys, his briefcase. And Kennedy is like, okay, I got to do something. So what does he do? He says, however, I can make you a private assurance that these missiles will be removed from Turkey if the Soviet agrees to remove the missiles from Cuba, in other words, the sites, and also agrees to United Nations inspection that they've been removed. Guys, that happened Saturday night. You know when we were supposed to start airstrikes? Monday morning. So what is that? About 36 hours from the possibility of war. Okay. I really like what happened, guys. I don't think I didn't live during this time period. I don't know if any of your parents did or your grandparents. But guys, I remember being like, okay, was this really that big of a threat? And I'll tell this story to end our period. My aunt, who just turned 80 just a couple of months ago, wonderful lady, she was a young mother at the time of this going on. And guys, there were people in lines to go see, confession, etc., because, it was such a tough time. But I remember asking her, I said, Aunt Linda, I said, was this as stressful as the history makes it out to be? And guys, my aunt starts getting really teary-eyed and upset. And she was a young mother of 2 twins at the time. And she told me this story. She said, I was rocking my 2 children, one in one arm, one in the other. I think it was an 8 o'clock address. And guys, she told me, she goes, I was crying, praying or hoping that my kids would live to see adulthood. Okay. Now here we are in 2021 and they are adults. But guys, the point is that this negotiation, Kennedy did, a very admirable job with it. I think it's safe to say not everybody agreed with him. There were a lot of people that wanted there to be more direct conflict. Okay. Guys, that is basically our lesson. Next time, we'll start to look a little bit more at the second Red Scare. All right. So that is basically the Cold War, bits and pieces until 1963. Okay. I would encourage you to kind of think about the connection to different world regions and also the big picture with containment. And as always, guys, feel free to email me. It's been a pleasure being with you, and I will see you next time. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.